Hirono, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for your testimony regarding what more we should be doing or could be doing to support Ukraine. Very briefly, for both of you, President Zelensky has called for a no-fly zone to push back on Russia and Ukraine, especially as Russia is now using cluster bombs to target civilian populations. From your perspective, what options exist to support Ukraine's request to help them push back Russia and gain air superiority, knowing full well that enforcing a no-fly zone could result in NATO forces, U.S. forces directly engaging with Russia?
Thank you, Senator. I think we just agreed here. I'll go first because my colleague deferred. Senator, I would have liked a no-fly zone about a week ago, before Russia owned the airspace, before it became a semi-permissive environment to a non-permissive environment. At this point, it is going to take a lot of effort to fight, whether it's NATO assets through or U.S. assets through, and will not necessarily result in a strategic outcome that I think we want to realize. I think we'd be better suited to supply the Ukrainians with fighter aircraft and allow them to combat Russian air assets over Ukraine. And we've been talking about how much NATO allies have done over the past few days. Unfortunately, I read news today that the fighter aircraft that were promised to the Ukrainians by some of our NATO allies will no longer move forward. So I think the emphasis, as I've outlined earlier in my testimony, should be on supplying the Ukrainian the aircraft and other capabilities they need to defend their territory and fight for their freedom, Senator.
You would have, I think we acknowledge that for enforcement of a no-fly zone, that could result in a pretty big escalation of what is happening in Ukraine. So there is that. I want to move to an issue that directly involves how we're going to meet the strategic needs of Indo-PACOM in the area of fuel. In recent years, the U.S. has enjoyed uncontested freedom of movement around the globe. However, advances in our competitors' technologies is taking this advantage away. Previously, large reserves of pre-positioned stocks at fixed sites like we see at Red Hill Bulk Fuel Storage in Hawaii and large fixed formations of troops serve the DoD well, but I think it is clear the posture of the department needs to change. So focusing on, once again, Red Hill, where there's been a tremendous concern about the fuel tanks, which endangers our aquifer on Oahu, which supplies the majority of the water needs of the people of Oahu, is leaking, and et cetera. So the Department of Defense is currently looking at ways to meet Indo-PACOM's fueling requirements that do not involve storing fuel underground at Red Hill, as I mentioned, which threatens Oahu's aquifer. What major factors do you recommend, both of you, recommend the department consider in order to find a suitable alternative to these massive fuel storage facilities?
Senator, I'm not familiar with the Indo-PACOM fuel storage requirements. I just will note I'm certainly more familiar on the Euro-Atlantic. The need for resilient petroleum reserves in multiple locations. Europe is finding itself without a strategic petroleum reserve, which is obviously now will be impactful to how Europe will address high energy prices and potential Russian cutoff of energy. This is a very important issue, but let me turn to my colleague for further elucidation.
I'll only add, I'm not familiar with the particular case, Senator, that you've raised, but I think some principles that come out of the National Defense Strategy should inform decision-making here. Whether it's pre-positioned stocks or fuel or logistical support, it's quite clear as we come up with an Indo-PACOM strategy, one that competes with China. We need to distribute our forces deeper into the region and contest there. And we need to come up with logistical frameworks, Transportation Command in particular, that recognizes the distribution of forces deeper into the Pacific region. And the major hub approach, perhaps, of the previous strategy is certainly not adequate, and it raises vulnerabilities.
The Red Hill facility pretty much is the fuel facility that meets a massive amount of the Indo-PACOM's fueling needs. So I think the key here is distributing our capabilities along those lines. Each year, combatant commandants publish a list of priorities for major items in their area of responsibility, which are not funded in the president's budget, even though these priorities are critical to the mission in their AOR. At times, there is a disconnect between what the combatant commanders identify as a need and what the services procure. Last year, I supported a pilot program within the Strategic Capabilities Office focused on closing the significant capabilities through an alternative process, basically to enable our combatant commanders to have a much stronger input into acquisitions for their AOR. For both of you, do you have any recommendations for additional changes to the current structures in the DoD that would feel the needs of our priorities theaters faster?
Senator, I don't have further recommendations.
I just think the unfunded priorities list is a very important tool for the U.S. Congress, carrying out their constitutional responsibility to raise and support armies and appropriate the military. And I think there's a place for them.
Well, it's very clear that the commanders would like a much greater voice in the priority decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. Senator Ernst, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for being here as well